Margaret was notoriously private, even more so upon her return. So, it was no surprise that Victoria brightened noticeably the moment Margaret stepped into the room at the gala, her silvery hair swept back and her elegant black dress a statement of understated sophistication. Cameras flashed as Margaret Windsor greeted guests, each attendee angling for her attention and hoping for even a few minutes of conversation. Victoria nudged Sarah as they spotted her across the room. "Stay back," she whispered, her eyes narrowed. "I don't want you embarrassing the family tonight, and I'll handle introductions myself." Victoria swept away, her designer gown trailing behind her, leaving Sarah standing by the sidelines. Margaret caught sight of Sarah almost instantly, her discerning eyes locking on her former pupil across the crowd. The slightest smile flickered across her lips, a knowing smile, a quiet greeting, and Sarah felt a wave of relief. She gave a subtle nod, knowing Margaret understood her wish for secrecy. Victoria, however, remained oblivious. As she reached Margaret, her charm at its peak, she extended her hand and introduced herself with a polished, "Miss Windsor, I'm Victoria Reed. We're practically family, as I'm the Caldwells' eldest daughter." "Ah, so you're Victoria," Margaret replied with a polite, impassive smile. Her eyes swept over Victoria's designer dress and practiced grace. "It's lovely to finally meet you." Victoria launched into her charm offensive, detailing her keen interest in Margaret's work and implying a shared kinship with the Caldwell name. Sarah watched from the edge of the room, and she could tell Margaret saw right through Victoria's act. But Margaret's expression remained serene, her tone polite, never betraying her thoughts. As the evening wore on, Victoria's attempts to ingratiate herself with Margaret only made her seem more desperate, her flawless demeanor beginning to show cracks. When Margaret finally excused herself, leaving Victoria visibly deflated, she made her way through the crowd towards Sarah. In a low whisper, Margaret leaned in, her tone warm with familiarity. "You've grown, Sarah," she said, glancing at her hands as if imagining them wrapped around delicate tools rather than crystal glasses. "Are you still designing?" "I am," Sarah replied, her voice soft but resolute. "In secret?" "For now." Margaret nodded approvingly, giving her a small, almost conspiratorial smile. "Good. There are things best kept hidden until the right moment." She placed a reassuring hand on Sarah's shoulder. "If you need anything, you know how to reach me. Don't let anyone take your light." Sarah watched as Margaret drifted back into the throng, leaving a trail of awestruck guests in her wake. Few days later, Eleanor Caldwell's footsteps echoed sharply against the marble floor of her study as she paced, her anger spiraling. She tightened her grip on her phone, unable to tear her eyes from the blaring headlines that flashed accusations, mockery, and speculation with every scroll. Socialite scandal, Victoria Caldwell's secret fling caught on camera. Perfect heiress or perfect disaster? Victoria Caldwell's latest entanglement raises eyebrows. The photographs left little to the imagination, Victoria, in a sleek dress, entwined with a man unmistakably familiar to those who kept tabs on high society romances. Victoria's ex-boyfriend, a notorious playboy with an appetite for risk and an unrepentant grin on his face. They were pictured just outside a bar, oblivious to the camera's gaze, Victoria's hand resting on his chest, the implication clear. It was an unforgivable slip, one Eleanor knew could easily incite even the family's closest allies to pull back, or worse, to whisper in places that mattered. She'd known Victoria could be reckless, impulsive, but this, the exposure, the blatant disregard for her own name, was more than she could bear. And it came just when Eleanor needed Victoria to step up and become the graceful, steady daughter she'd always trained her to be. She could feel her control slipping, the legacy she'd built for decades beginning to wobble. The door to the study opened without so much as a knock, and Victoria entered, nonchalant and unhurried, her shoulders back and chin up as if the headlines were nothing but a breeze in her perfectly arranged hair. Eleanor turned to her, eyes flashing. "Care to explain why half of New York knows about your latest indiscretion before I do?" Victoria, as always, seemed unaffected, offering only the hint of an amused smile. "It's nothing serious, Mother. The press exaggerates, they always do. It'll blow over in a few days." "Blow over? Is that what you think?" Eleanor's tone was dangerously low. "Have you forgotten who you are? Or do you just not care?" Victoria's expression hardened, but she held her tongue, arms crossing in a show of defiance. The silence between them deepened. Eleanor's fury simmered, fueled by a disappointment she could no longer ignore. This is the last straw, Victoria, Eleanor continued. We needed you to be an example, a symbol of refinement and integrity. We needed you to represent this family, our values. What do you think this scandal does to all of that? The weight of Eleanor's words settled on Victoria, but her gaze remained steely, her lips curving in an almost mocking smirk. Perhaps you should have thought of that before dragging me into this family, she retorted coldly. Before you took me from the only people who would actually care. Eleanor's face paled, but she forced herself to keep her composure. This jab cut too close to the truth, the fractured reality they both tried to ignore. She clenched her jaw, steeling herself against the tide of emotions welling up within her. She had invested years, countless resources, and unrelenting discipline into Victoria's future. The idea that it could unravel so easily, because of Victoria's own self-destructive defiance, was unthinkable. Very well, then, Eleanor replied icily, her voice a calculated calm. Since your loyalty is so fleeting, perhaps I should turn my attention to someone who values this family's name. Victoria's smirk faltered, a flicker of unease flashing in her eyes. What's that supposed to mean? It means, Eleanor said, letting each word sink in, that perhaps your sister, Sarah, should take a more central role in this family. She at least has the sense to uphold our values. At the mention of Sarah, a dark expression crossed Victoria's face. But Eleanor was relentless, watching her daughter for any sign of humility, any flicker of understanding, yet finding only resentment. Sarah, Victoria said, spitting the name as if it were poison. You think she could take my place? Maybe she could, Eleanor replied, the finality in her tone leaving no room for argument. She is at least willing to respect what this family stands for, which is more than I can say for you. For the first time, Victoria seemed genuinely rattled. Her indifference faded, replaced by a fierce, bitter anger. You'd replace me with her? A girl who's barely been in this house? She's nothing, Eleanor. She doesn't know the first thing about this life. Perhaps she doesn't, Eleanor replied, unruffled. But at least she's willing to learn. She doesn't see this family as a tool for her own amusement. And frankly, Victoria, I am beginning to think that's more valuable than any pretense of belonging. Victoria looked at her mother, her face a perfect mask of indignation, yet underneath, something shifted. The realization that Eleanor might actually follow through on this threat seemed to strike her deeply. But she held her composure, narrowing her eyes, her voice lowered to a venomous murmur. You can let her play house, Victoria said, her voice laced with a bitter confidence. But she'll never be me. She'll never live up to what you really want, Eleanor. She doesn't know you like I do. With that, she turned on her heel, leaving Eleanor in the silence of the study, the cold weight of her own words settling in. Eleanor's heart pounded, her anger still simmering, her gaze drifting to the window overlooking the expansive garden. Below, Sarah moved through the rows of flowers she'd nurtured herself. Watching Sarah, Eleanor felt an odd pang, a flicker of a thought that she hadn't yet allowed herself to acknowledge. Maybe this girl, so different from the daughter she'd raised, had something essential that Victoria lacked. Perhaps it was time she gave that a chance to grow. Eleanor and Richard Caldwell read through the impeccably printed letter resting on the table between them. Gold embossed on ivory paper, it was from the Blake family, the wealthiest and most influential family in the city. Their son, Alexander Blake, though recently confined to a wheelchair, was still hailed as the most eligible bachelor. The letter's formality masked what was truly an opportunity, a marriage proposal that could secure the Caldwells' reputation, possibly even repair the damage caused by Victoria's recent scandal. This could be the answer we've been waiting for, Eleanor murmured, her gaze intense as she scanned the letter for the third time. It would bring stability to our name. Imagine, the Caldwells united with the Blakes. Richard, seated across from her, nodded with a sigh of relief. The stress of recent weeks had deepened the lines on his face, and the prospect of finally securing Victoria's future, and the family's reputation, brought a glimmer of hope to his otherwise weary expression. Do you think she'll see it that way? Richard asked, brows knitting with concern. Victoria's recent defiance was still fresh in his memory, and her unpredictability made this moment all the more tenuous. Eleanor's lips pressed into a determined line. She won't have a choice. After everything she's done, this is the least she can do to restore what she's cost us. Summoning Victoria to the room, Eleanor and Richard exchanged a final glance. Moments later, Victoria appeared, a vision of poise and indifference. She carried herself with a cool, effortless grace, a hand grazing the back of the velvet chair as she looked between her parents, already wary. "What's this about?" she asked, her tone edged with impatience. "Sit down, Victoria. We have some news for you," Eleanor began, her voice holding a firmness that left no room for argument. Victoria slid gracefully into the chair, crossing her legs elegantly. She gave Eleanor a mildly curious look, masking any hint of interest. "Go on." "It's an offer of marriage," Richard said, trying to keep his voice light. "From the Blakes. Alexander Blake, to be exact." Victoria's cool mask fell for a split second, replaced by a flash of surprise. She raised a skeptical brow, a dry laugh escaping her lips. "You can't be serious. Alexander Blake? The man in a wheelchair?" Richard bristled, but Eleanor stepped in, her voice calm yet forceful.